So we've talked about industry views. Could you also share how the U.S. government views Chinese technology industry and what are the logics behind those lists of parties and concerns?
The U.S., of course, you have Congress. And so you have the administration trying to make policy on China more broadly, within which these export control issues are part of a broader China policy. And then you have the Congress, which right now there's something like 300 bills on China in Congress, right? So Congress, there's a lot of bipartisan support, particularly on the Republican side, for bills to restrict technology or other kinds of other restrictions on Chinese companies based on a whole range of issues. So the Hill, as Congress, is putting a lot of pressure on the administration to sort of be tough on China. And so that's the political environment we're in, within which all of these decisions around export controls and other things are happening. There's also this broader thing that we've called this U.S.-China tech Cold War, which is the sense that the U.S. and China are in this competition over the technologies of the future, like semiconductors, quantum computing, AI. So in December, for example, we saw the first Chinese quantum computing companies put on the entity list, again, for alleged support to Chinese military efforts to deploy different kinds of quantum systems. So that was a big deal. So you have AI companies, semiconductor companies, artificial intelligence companies. All these are areas where there's this sort of meme out there that the US and China are locked in this competition for these technologies. Now, I've tried to argue, and here and other places, that some of these areas, like in AI, there's been tremendous collaboration between US companies and Chinese researchers in AI, for example. So there's been a tendency to view in Congress in particular, to view these as sort of zero-sum games. Chinese companies advance in semiconductors or advance in AI or advance in quantum, and US companies lose. I think that's a very sort of a narrow way to look at things, because if you look at how those sectors develop, again, semiconductors being an example, it's a global industry. The discussion really, I think, should be, where do Chinese companies fit in to the global division of labor in that tech sector, and under what conditions? If they're heavily subsidized, okay, let's talk about subsidies. Because lots of countries do subsidies. Why are China's subsidies a problem? Let's talk about that and discuss how to reduce those subsidies so that to level the playing field, for example, in the semiconductor arena. In AI, again, I think there's been this great history of collaboration. I was at a really good conference just before the pandemic in Guangzhou, where I met, this is an example I use, I met some Chinese PhD students who had gone to the US, studied at the University of Chicago, and developed an AI algorithm for detecting cancer. And then because the US HIPAA laws around healthcare data are very complicated, they went back to China, trained the algorithm, developed relationships with Chinese hospitals, also being concerned about privacy. And then they trained their algorithm, and they came back to the US, and their AI is being used in US hospitals. They're hiring US engineers. So again, to look at that as sort of AI, who's winning in that situation, right? China or the US? You could argue both are winning. Right. So that's why I think that sort of meme of sort of zero sum that is really dangerous, because it doesn't really reflect the reality of how those industries develop. Now, of course, there are military applications of AI and quantum, but most of the action in that area, and again, same with semiconductors, the vast majority of semiconductors are being used for commercial gains and for commercial products. Semiconductors are being used in your phone and in all sorts of microelectronics. Yes, there are those semiconductors, that's a small part of those that are being used for military and national security related applications. But the vast majority of these are sort of what are called dual use technologies. And the dual is military and civilian, and most of it is civilian. So even calling it dual use is a little bit misleading, in the sense that many of these technologies are inherently commercial to begin with. And then it's really the application or system that the product ends up in, which is then could be called a military system.
The Commerce Department faced a lot of critiques when they tried to collect business data from semiconductor industry. Do you think such policy may reoccur in the future?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I mean, it was a really unusual situation with the global chip shortage, and I think there was a feeling that these supply chains were not very transparent. But this was a very hard exercise, right? Because most of those companies did not want to turn over client confidential data, customer confidential data. And so they provided some general information around their capacity, and some of their supply chains worked. And the Commerce Department is still reviewing that data now, and will probably make some recommendations on what to do. But this was a very unusual situation, right? It was like once in a lifetime kind of a thing, the combination of the pandemic. So the industry view is that they would prefer not to have government intervene much here, but they would prefer to let the market forces work out the shortage here. So part of it was a political issue. I think auto industry in the US is very powerful. And I think there was pressure on the administration to do something to help with that because, those companies were clearly suffering because they couldn't get semiconductors and they were having to lay off workers. So it was a complicated situation in which I think the Commerce Department was trying to help. But yeah, there was a lot of criticism because they were asking for proprietary information from non-US companies, including in Taiwan and South Korea and Japan. And so I think they probably got enough information to at least make some recommendations. That what they'll probably end up recommending is that people manage their supply chains better and don't have just in time and don't stockpile. You don't have sufficient stockpile in case there are problems. The shortages, we had these crazy situations where we had a fire in a factory in Japan and you had a freeze in Texas that impacted things. And so those were also sort of once in a lifetime, you want hope situations. And so I think the industry view is, yes, maybe government can make some recommendations here, but skeptical that they don't really want government intervention here in this sector because again, it's very market driven and complicated, and so you don't want to have government mucking around too much in there and maybe making things worse. So I think that probably won't happen in 2022, but I think Commerce will have to come out with some recommendations that says, okay, companies should do this. Maybe they should work through brokers to make sure that they have access to sufficient stockpiles. So in case there's a sudden shortage, they're not caught completely off guard as they were in this case, particularly the automakers.